We'll start the proceedings. Genevieve's going to do a karakia.
He honere, he kororia, mangarongo ki te whenua. Whakaro pai e, ki nā tangata katoa. Ake, 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 amene.
Amene.
Thank you. Right, starting proceedings today, we have a workshop on the proposed amendments to the Regulation Hearings Committee Terms of Reference. As we all know at the moment, the committee has one delegated authority to approve commissioners to hear various applications. It is a wee bit of a source of contention that we can't discuss any other matters, but I'm delighted to hear this presentation today to see what proposed amendments to our delegations could be heard. Councillor Edge.
Just to advise that Councillor Southworth's just running a few minutes late.
Who is?
Councillor Southworth is just running a few minutes
late.
Thank you.
All right, we'll hand over to Paul and Robin to...
Just before they kick into that, so this here is the second workshop that you've had on this topic, and you've got the presentation, but you've also got the updated draft terms of reference with proposed changes in it, based on feedback from your previous workshop, and the team will talk you through that. And the idea is that depending on where we get to in terms of feedback, that this would come to council for endorsement in March, I think it is. Yeah. So you've got Paul and Robin over there, and they'll take us through it. Over to you, Paul.
Kia ora, Council. Good morning, everyone. Just say that, yeah, as Stephen said, purpose is just to get your feedback today on proposed changes to the Regulation Hearing Committee Terms of Reference, so which includes also the establishment of an advisory panel. And so we'll just take you through that. We'll go as quick as you can, because I suspect the benefit of this workshop will be your feedback and hearing from you more than hearing from me. So if I go on to the next point, the background, review of Council Committee's arrangements in mid-2024 did not address the terms of reference, and you requested that it be addressed in the future, which is the process that we're going through now. The current review of the delegation manual, General Council explored possible options to expand the terms of reference so that committee members could act as an advisory panel to the Chief Executive in relation to certain litigation matters. And then there was an opportunity identified to provide operational reporting to the committee, so broadening the remit of the committee to some degree. And as Stephen alluded to, we had a workshop on the 11th of December with the committee just to get the first stage of the feedback. So the feedback that from HRXC is as follows. General support for the proposals. Needed to ensure how many additional monitoring information provided to the committee didn't duplicate what was going to the Regional Delivery Committee, and I can talk to that in a little bit more detail. The committees were keen to see information about the outcomes of commissioners' hearings, and that's something that we're still thinking how we can do that for the hearing committee. That the minutes should go to the council agendas for information, and we would ensure that that happens if you support these changes. And also there was support for an advisory panel around certain litigation decisions. So currently the terms of reference and the current committee, the membership is made up of 7 councillors with a quorum of 2. And that's, I think that's based on the fact that the Regional Hearings Committee needs to meet regionally regularly, and sometimes promptly in response to appointing commissioners. So that's why the quorum is lower than you would expect to see in a kind of a more normal committee setup. But the objectives are to consider and decide consent applications in accordance with delegations, appoint hearing commissioners, appoint hearing committees and commissioners, and exercise other powers as delegated to them. So that's your sort of standard terms of reference. So if I go through to the changes, so the purpose of the committee being available to appoint commissioners is unchanged. It's an essential role and legally required, so remains unchanged. The regulatory reporting, the consents and compliance monitoring enforcement reporting, this is really what I would say operational regulatory reporting in a dashboard that will give the measures and confidence that we're undertaking our regulatory functions as would be expected by council. Perhaps a little bit more detail than would go through to regional delivery committee, but certainly the core metrics that make up what we would consider the key performance indicators of a good regulatory practice would come before the committee in like I say, in the form of a dashboard, and it would allow you to have a little bit more detailed conversation around those matters. As I said, the Regional Delivery Committee would still receive overall regulatory assurance reporting, as has been agreed by this council, that the assurance reporting goes to the RDC. And then the other change is that the advisory panel would be established to support the Chief Executive when exercising certain delegated authorities regarding litigation decisions. So those are the changes. A few more. This was a conversation in the Regional Hearings Committee workshop. So we've tightened up the wording to say that the committee would be there to review operational implementation policies and guidelines relating to consenting and compliance monitoring and enforcement. For example, our CME guidelines would be something that we're due to update that we'd bring before that committee for the consideration and feedback. So we're not talking about strategies or regional plans. That wouldn't be the purpose of that committee. And the other recent thing that is adventuring, as you will no doubt be all aware of, is the fast track approvals. So we've considered bringing to this committee for consideration those technical responses will likely be given by this council as part of that fast track process as well. So the idea being that as and when those timeframes are enacted, staff would go and complete those, those technical assessments, and then bring that before the committee for the consideration before it went through the final process. So that was a recent addition, I suppose, in response to the fast track changes. I'm going to hand over to Robin now to take you through the advisory panel.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, councillors. The advisory panel is terms of reference the Appendix A to the changes. So this is a complete deviation from what we've had previously for the panel. The purpose is to support the Chief Executive, as Paul has outlined, so that when they are exercising their delegated authority regarding certain litigation decisions, it won't be all litigation decisions, then there will be the flexibility to call the panel. The membership will be a maximum of 3 members of the Regulation Hearing Committee, and it's proposed in the draft terms that that be the chair of the committee and then 2 further members who have obtained their certification under the Making Good Decisions program. And those 2 will be appointed to the panel by the chair of the committee as the proposal. There'd also be room for the ex officio, which will be the chair of council as well. The frequency will be as required because obviously the litigation decisions come at us without notice. And you'll see there the scope is outlined that clarifies that it will largely focus on judicial review proceedings or applications for declarations rather than regulatory matters. The process for triggering would be by email from the Chief Executive to those panel members. And panel members, there's a note there that they'd have to be vigilant, as always, in relation to conflicts of interest. And that brings me to the slide where obviously just confirming that the delegation would still sit with the Chief Executive. This is a advisory collaborative process and we'd need to retain the delegation with the Chief Executive because of the reasons outlined there. As we've been through previously, could potentially be perceptions of bias, political influence, separation of functions, and timeliness of decisions and legal privilege. They will all be considerations for the panel members when consulting with the Chief Executive in that environment.
Genevieve.
Just confirming that this workshop has been recorded or streamed. Thank you. I have a lot of hesitation about this comment, and I'm wondering who actually formulated this particular scope here, because a lot of red flags are coming up for me. And, you know, when we talk about perception of bias or conflicts, the very formulation of that advisory group gives me red flags. So I am concerned about who provided the scope of this, if it was a legal oversight because of legal risk, or if it was advised from the advisory group that wishes to be in that mix.
I understand that this was a collaborative approach raised by councillors and also in consultation with the Chief Executive. We've had similar panels set up previously at Council. We have one in relation to the appeals concerning PC7. Sorry. So it's not out of the ordinary. Also, the Chief Executive may have the delegation for making these decisions, but if decisions are of a significant, a higher significance as set out in our significance engagement policy, there is always that discretion that the Chief Executive does consult and collaborate with Council on those decisions. So this would just be a more formal process of allowing that to happen as and when these cases face Council.
Joe had a question. Joe.
Just got a couple of questions. Just a couple of questions. So the next steps around the amendments and the work here. So will it go to RHC for support and then to Council for the adoption? Straight to Council.
My understanding will after this we'll take your feedback and then it'll come back to Council. I think we're looking at March to come back to Council. Yeah.
Councillor South.
Oh, sorry, just a supplementary. What interests me about this, and actually, I support the changes and the advisory panel because that is a new step that we don't currently have. So I don't see it as being. I mean, I'd be quite interested to understand more Councillor Robinson's perspective around the red flags here. But I just had an idea pop into my head around the certification under the Making Good Decisions program, and this may be more for Lisa, but it could actually be good if all of the members on that committee every triennium actually receive that education, because it's like $2,000 per new member, so that would probably be, that'd probably be $10,000-$20,000, but that would be probably a good investment into that committee and the expertise on that committee. I don't know if that could be incorporated.
Yeah, I think I'll try to respond. I think it would be up to the councillors to make that determination if they wanted to go through that course, but we would certainly encourage it, and it's consistent across other regional councils where councillors do obtain that certification. So
because we can get it for our PD funding, but it might actually be good to just have a separate little pot there just specifically for those members, because the cost is quite a lot out of the total PD funding, and it's good opportunities.
Just going back a couple of slides, we talked about duplication of information with the Regional Delivery Committee. Why would not, we've got a regulatory committee established, why would not the any functions that relate to regulatory matters be dealt with at that committee rather than regional development?
it's a really good question. I think there's a a need and perhaps a desire around the council table to have what I would call operational reporting in a reasonably regular manner around key measures that give council assurance that from a reasonably frequent sense that we're doing what is expected of us. And I think that's sensible to have that in the Regional Hearings Committee. And we've discussed kind of a dashboard that gives you a sense of, are we on time frames with consenting?
Well, the Regulatory Hearings Committee would meet more frequently than the Regional Development Committee. So still my view that regulatory matters should sit within the Regulatory Committee, and perhaps some sort of a report to the Regional Development Committee. But I certainly think if you dealing with operational matters or performance of our regulatory team, in my view, it should be a function of the Regulatory Hearings Committee and a report to the Regional Development Committee, not the other way around.
I don't necessarily disagree, but I think the reporting that from a regulatory perspective that will go to the Regional Delivery Committee will be part of a package of activities that get reported to the regional. So like compliance and consenting and our land and water programs and our biosecurity and biodiversity programs. So the kind of the overall picture and consent and compliance being a component of that overall picture that will go to regional delivery committees. So I think we're saying the same thing. I think, Chair. Yeah.
Councillor Sunkel.
Thank you. Just in relation to the advisory committee being made up of RHC members with their ticket, I've made a decision that I don't want to go that way. I don't want to get into that position, but equally sitting on the PC7 and my time here and an understanding of law and a whole bunch of things, is there a reason that one must have a ticket to sit on this committee and be solely confined to the RHC when some of us probably have a lot more experience, or a lot of experience, I won't say more, but choose not to go into that space?
Through the chair, that's a matter that would rest with yourselves. If we've put the recommendation that the draft proposal is that the committee members undertake that training, we believe that it would be valuable for those members to bring the learnings from that training to that forum. But equally, if it was decided by the majority to not have that, then it wouldn't be a legal reason to prevent that.
Councillor Southworth.
Thank you. First, just picking up on Joe's, Councillor Davies' comment about training. I wonder if there is an opportunity to get a discount on the training cost if we were to do something specifically for this group. I think they do offer that, and sometimes they're quite infrequent that they occur. In the training opportunity occurs in Christchurch, so I signed up one time and then it was just, by the time it came, it clashed with something. Anyway, so I think that would be worth exploring. In terms of both I think for me, there still needs to be full council oversight. So, for example, the assurance around CME and so on that you just talked about, like a subset of council, is such a fundamental, important part of our council's role that it needs to have the whole of council oversight on it. Very comfortable with things coming through on that more frequent basis through the Regulation Hearing Committee. Personally, I'd like to see that information actually sent out to all councillors. Perhaps when those agendas go out, they come to all of us as a flag that we can look if we want to. I know they sit there in our, I appreciate they sit there on the calendar if we go onto the whole web page, but I think a reminder, because this is stepping up, this is fundamentally stepping up what this committee is doing, and it is a subset of councillors. In terms of the CE's advisory group, and acknowledging the CE has the final say, and I think that's fair. But I think that the additional members, fair enough to have the chair of Regulation Hearing Committee go through to that panel, but I think the other two members should be a selection from the whole of council. And, that has happened with other committees, subcommittees and things, or small advisories that have been set up. There's been oversight of the whole of council. I think there's too much risk, specifically because you're saying perceptions of bias and political influence. That's the reason for the delegation going to the CE. The same applies to a subset of councillors that are hand-selected by the chair of Regulation Hearing Committee. So it has to go through the whole of council, that additional 2, in my view. And same for the fast track. Like, I am concerned if there's the fast track proposals are going to be so politically, they're going to be big and political, no doubt about that. And so advice that's going out from this council, that's our council staff's recommendations or views on those, that needs to be seen by the whole of council and approved by the whole of council, in my view. So fine for advice to come through Regulation Hearing Committee, but I think we all need oversight. And I do appreciate that there could be a very fast turnaround, if anything, it's called fast track, right? So we might only be given a week to get it through, but we could at least have oversight through email again. We just got to use the mechanisms we have to get things looked at fast, but I think needs to be all of council, because it is so political. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor Edge, and then a comment from Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of things. The Regulation Hearings Committee is one of 2 council statutory committees. The other one is the RHC, standing committees. So there is a bit of distance from the other committees, and the responsibilities are slightly different too. And the other thing, one of the importance, the issue of the Making Good Decisions program, we're responsible for making sure that when we're considering these things that we relate to the RMA, and the Ministry for the Environment has an approved course and decision-making course which people go through. I like the idea that maybe all members of the committee would be ideally taking that course, but they don't. And it is time consuming, but it is a very rigorous process. I've received my recertification till 2029. So there's that recertification process it's a bit of an ongoing, so it's really important. And I think in that, I'll come back to some comments specifically on that, but just for the starting point, in terms of the terms of reference, perhaps at the beginning, if you could identify a quorum, I think a quorum of just 2 people was unsatisfactory, and maybe looking at 4 or 5. I'm not sure, but just it needs to be more, in my view. In terms of the items 2 there, A through to F, generally A to E is fine. I'll come back in a little minute with some comments about F in terms of what that might mean. I'll discuss it now, actually. One of the things that I find, or the committee that struggle with, is the notification process, and how our staff go through that decision-making process. Now, it's very clear in the RMA, the description of Section 95A about the steps that need to be taken as part of that process. But there seems to be what I'm unclear about. If there are any changes to that step process, because there are 2 components of the notification process. Certainly I've run off version 2022, but I think it applies to, is step 3 of the process, step 3, section 8B, that public notification is required in certain circumstances, so it gives those. But in 8B, it says the consent authority decides in accordance with Section 95D that the activity will have or is likely to have adverse effects on the environment that are more than minor. So that's something that our process can actually determine that level of more than minor or less than minor. And then I suppose it's some. Is that something that comes to the committee, or are the committee advised about how that decision is made? So it's just clarification of that. And is that still current RMO? The other thing, step 4, which is, and both of these things I'm talking about are of concern to the community, about that determination that is able for this organisation to sort. The other in step 4, public notification in special circumstances. Determine whether special circumstances exist in relation to the application that warrant the application of being publicly notified. And it is what are the guidance that staff have in determining special circumstances? Some information. I don't need to know it now, but there are a few councillors that have received some communication from people in Waimakariri, for example, about an application. They're completely in the dark. They've written to WDC staff, our staff, councillors, and they're wanting to know why it can't be publicly notified. But so it's kind of like, what is in special circumstances, what does that mean? It would be good to get some clarification on that in terms of the decision making, and whether or not that is something that staff perhaps are more cognizant of in the weighting that they give to those consents operations. So it's, how are they determined really, and whether that comes through in that particular item F would be useful. The other thing that might be useful, just in terms of the operational thing, I went on this morning to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and they have a resource consent holders guide, but I'm just wondering, it would have been useful for me and the other councillors that were on this communication list to have to be able to send off a document that says, dear Mr. Public, this is what's happening. This is why there's been no information. We can't communicate with you at the moment because there's a legal process that we have to follow. So just a very simple thing like that would be really, really useful for us. The other, so that's just on F. I don't know what the scope was on that. In what part?
Well, you've done a good making good decisions course, right? And that is pretty straightforward. That the consenting process and when that is put in place, how that's handled. Okay, and we've had Councillor Southworth talk about political interference. It sounds to me, this is what I'm hearing. It may be not what you think you're saying, is that you're wanting to be involved in the process. Now we know the process. Can I just finish this? We know the process is in-house. Our processes have been in-house since 2010 when the commissioners took over here, and they decided to have the function of the CME function, the consenting monitoring enforcement function, in-house, and councillors weren't to have anything to do with that. Now, I think the point that we need to make, if you want to get back into that space, then we need to overhaul the whole system.
No, I'm not wanting to get back into that space. I'm simply suggesting that when those things come to the council, that there are two components that we don't often hear about. It's very good this last session we had when it was clear that some public notification went through, but understanding what that process and that decision-making process in-house would be quite good. But in special circumstances, I don't know, and the community is concerned about special consideration. We can do it, circumstances here in-house, and there's no communication to the public about perhaps why that wasn't the case. But anyway, I'm not saying that the committee itself gets involved. I'm just saying in the staff assessment process, those two things, right?
A statutory function under Section 95, and there is a process to go through.
Sorry,
and I'm confident that our staff go through that Section 95A process, and perhaps there may be a need for some communication to the wider public about that process. But I certainly don't want to sort of step into an area that is defined by statute, essentially.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's just some clarification about that process.
Well, it is defined by statute.
It is.
And I don't really see how we can subvert what is already in the Section 95A process. You're asking for us to have some input into the reasoning behind why something should be publicly or
I'm not.
notification.
I'm not. I'm not. I'm just wanting to understand and just to make sure that those two things are also how are they being considered internally, I suppose, and just some information and feedback on that. There are circumstances in assessing whether something is more than minor or less than minor, and do we consider the precautionary approach? So it's just how I don't understand how the staff are actually determining those things, which would be good to know.
The staff are directed by the RMA, Section 95A, how to process an application and whether it should be publicly notified, limited notified, or any other consideration. They are required to follow a set process through the RMA, and I don't see us. Maybe Robin might want to give us a.
Okay.
Through the chair, I just wonder if it would help. I think some clarification that staff would be willing to provide an assurance piece, if that's what you're looking for in your role as governance, of the process, and that would give you something that you could feed back to your community.
That sounds a good idea. Now, Stephen, you want to make a comment?
I think that would be useful, and it may be that assurance is part of the information that comes to the committee. And just quickly moving on to the actual idea of the advisory panel, I have a few comments on that. I don't really see why we could, or perhaps we could, so there's a broader perspective on the advice to the CE, that this process of that comes to the whole of the RHC as a panel, and that the matters of concern that are being raised by the CE just for her advice are in a PX session. So it's a special PX session that actually takes into consideration the people that have undertaken the Making Good Decision program, but also those on the committee who haven't. But generally in the context of advice. Now, whether or not there's some the people who Making Good Decision process have obviously a greater understanding, presumably, of the process and the responsibilities of that, and distance themselves from that bias thing that you had this stuff up here. Because it's very, very clear what we have to do. So, I mean, that is one thought that I had. My other thing on that second bullet point there, making good decisions, not just obtaining the certification, but actually have current certification. I think that's important because I don't think people have indicated that they might have taken the course, but if they're not current, or have they not been recertified, I think that shouldn't apply. And the situation where a chair, for example, is perhaps have a perception of bias or conflict of interest, what's the decision making, who identifies those people? And also in a situation where there are more than two people on the panel who have the course, that maybe there's some rollover and it's not always the same two people. That there's some flexibility in that. So that's really my comments, and I think that in terms of the fast track stuff, I think too that is a kind of an issue, and I think if this process is followed, I don't see any reason why keeping it broader. But I think as long as there's the political stuff is perhaps set aside, that is on the merits of the assessment of the advice we're getting. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, you had a comment. I have Councillor Mackenzie next, and then Councillor Scott.
Look, just very quickly, I'll just make two comments. I was just going to make one, but I thought I'd make another one. In terms of the matters you're raising, Councillor Edge, there is a lot of information on our website around the consent processing and how that works, and what can and can't be shared with the community. And some of that information would probably be useful if you needed it to share with constituents and things like that. So, and happy to sort of walk you through or show you any of that stuff and talk to you about it. So I'll just make that comment. My second comment really was just around reporting. I just wanted to make a suggestion really. When this comes back to council, I think it might be useful for us in the paper to talk about in a little bit more detail, because I think we're talking past each other around the different levels of reporting. So one of them is around quality assurance, and that the full council has that in terms of our CME functions, and I totally agree with you, Councillor Southwards, that's a really important thing. The other is more detailed operational level reporting, and maybe we could mock that up in the paper so you could see, and then that way you could make a choice as to how much information full council sees versus this committee. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thanks, David. One of the things we've discussed as a council, and I know, Stephen, you tend to be on side with us, is that we want to move to a sort of more enabling, less consenting, more permitted activity status, so that more stuff gets done. We have less rules and regulations. Well, certainly that's what a lot of people think in the community. And I guess to me, one of the black holes sitting around this council is, and it's not about the consenting process, it's about the result of the consenting process. So when consents are issued, some go through a relatively easy system, some go through a long, expensive and contorted regime. It seems to me that what we don't get as a council is the merits of the process, or what are the merits of the outcomes in comparison to the cost and processes that they've gone through to get to there. So if you've got a rubbish dump that costs $5 million to get to the end point, was that a justified process? When we're looking back and saying, what can we learn from that process and the environmental outcomes that have been achieved by that expensive and long-winded process? Are we treating our communities? Are we doing this the right way, or is there a better way of doing it? And I guess that's. I don't think as a council we get that information from. So this has nothing to do with what Grant's talking about in terms of trying to interfere with the process. This is actually looking at the results of the progress and saying, what are the environmental outcomes we've got? Are the consent conditions for this particular rubbish dump any different to what they, as a result of that long-winded process, than if we'd gone through this process and made it quicker, shorter, cheaper, and just said, these are the outcomes we want to get out of granting this consent in the first place. And if we are as a council going to make a decision to move to a less regulatory, less rules and consenting process and more enabling with more permitted activities, and I think that's the sort of information we need to know, so we know what is, where are the areas we do need tough rules and regulations, and where are the areas we can back up a bit, if that makes sense. And I was sort of vaguely hoping that perhaps the regulatory committee might pick up that sort of function.
Thanks, Councillor. Look, I mean, you live with the current settings that you've got, and we've picked and chosen a bunch of interventions, and that's what staff are implementing. And whether or not we're implementing those things within timeframes and implementing them appropriately and well, that there is for the regulatory piece, that's the purpose of this committee. The point you raise around are those things that we are doing, the actions that we are doing, contributing in the most smart and best way to outcomes, because we're in the game of outcomes, we've got an impact framework in our LTP, and that will be reported to councillors. The outcomes, how we're progressing on those, and the contribution of those actions towards that. I don't see that as the responsibility of this particular committee.
No.
Okay, look, and that's very good advice, but I don't think as councillors in the 5 years I've been sitting here, we've actually had that information reported to us in a form which I find educational in terms of how we might move forward on some of these things.
I think perhaps your sort of a summation of that would be sort of a lessons learnt from some significant applications and putting that back into our processes. Moving on, Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you. So I just really want to concentrate on some of the comments that have been made around the thing. So the legal advice that that the CE receives is pretty wide when issues like this come up, and not only from our in-house counsel, but also from a wider range of legal advice that she gets. I would think that we need to understand this is purely the CEO's function. It is not a council function to make this decision. And I've just struggled a bit with an advisory panel because I don't think the CE needs an advisory panel, but she needs, I shouldn't personalise that. The CEO will need a sounding board, more of a sounding board than an advisory panel, because you can be sure before this gets to councillors or the advisory panel, be pretty firm in terms of the view of where they're going to head with these things. So I think it's more about the political implications and the fallout from those things that needs to be understood. I'm absolutely adamant that anybody that gets involved in any advisory panel to see on these matters needs to have done this course, right? They need to have done the Making Good Decisions course. It's critical that they do this. The matters that are before us as a council are RMA based, and having an understanding how the RMA works is a help. It's not a solution for everything that we do. I mean, the points of law and the interpretation of the points of law that are brought forward in these issues are something that takes a little more than a bushman's knowledge of the law to understand. But that Making Good Decisions course does help that, because it's very clear that you can only make those decisions based on the fact and based on the RMA. Now, I'm a current holder of Making Good Decisions course and about to do my chair's course actually, and have had the privilege in this building when Professor Skelton was here of hearing consents and actually writing advice on consents for this. So I think that that's something that we need to go back to. That's my personal opinion on that, not on this term obviously, but that gives councillors a better foundation for actually providing the sort of thing that you're talking about here. Because unless you've been there and done that, now I think you have, David, at the city, you've been part of that, you know, the grey areas are a lot clearer. And that's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robinson.
Sorry, I was actually just going to agree with a lot of Councillor Mackenzie's comments earlier, but I think that would be covered in what you recommended, Robin, on the assurance from staff and legal justification, you know, some sort of feedback, and I think that would be covered. So it's as simple as that type of reporting would be really good. Making good decisions is definitely a good idea. Unfortunately, I have actually done the course, but I haven't done the last thing that you had to do. I haven't. Well, I've been granted a slight extension, so that's good. But anyway, what was I going to say? I think it's definitely more than just that, because if we've got a small group, an advisory group that has 3 members and all are conflicted on something, we're stuffed. So we need a bigger catchment of options, and it should be part of the whole committee as a whole, as opposed to just a subset. That's just what I think.
Councillor Southworth.
In terms of the less rules and regs again, agree, makes sense, but there has to be a commensurate increase in CME and compliance and oversight of permitted activities. And in some ways, I don't think it's so much less rules and regs. It's more onus on the land user to comply with the settings of what permitted activity is. There isn't no rules around permitted activity. There are rules. It's just that you take it on yourself to comply with those, is my understanding. And they don't have to go through a consent process. And I think everybody could agree that the consent process, if it's not essential, is wasted money that could be spent on something else. But there's a responsibility on people to then comply. It also could mean more areas of exclusion of that land use as well, like in the high risk stuff. Maybe we just draw lines and say, we can't cover the whole region in CME, and there are some areas that are just too sensitive that we have more excluded activity as well. In terms of the special circumstances that Councillor Edge was talking about, I think the Kaituna Valley is an example. The feedlot is one where there was a start, and that did get communicated with us as to why there had been a different decision made by the overarching organisationally compared with what the planning officers initially put forward, and that was communicated quite well, I think. So that has been done before. And I think in terms of the changes that Councillor Mackenzie was asking about, that's the Land and Water Regional Plan, I believe, the integrated plan, that would see those changes in terms of permitted activities and our settings. And unfortunately, I think that's somewhat curtailed by the fact that we haven't been able to put our regional policy statement through, which was the first step in order to meet that. So it's a bit of an own goal or a government goal in delaying some of those changes that we might have made, unfortunately.
Thank you.
One point I disagree with Vicky on is that the RPS, the draft RPS, actually enabled those changes. It didn't. It was actually going the wrong direction, and I think that's why, as a council, we need better information so we do know what we're agreeing to when we agree to it. And the RPS is a classic case of actually going in the wrong direction, saying the right things but going in the wrong way.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments? I think my summation of what I've heard around the table, one key aspect that I think would be valuable to include in a new terms of reference is, as Councillor Edge has raised, an assurance report on the notification process. That I think would solve a large amount of angst that does surface from time to time in the committee. And secondly, I think the advisory panel probably needs a little bit more work. There's some issues some valid issues that a number of people have raised, and certainly I think there's some good aspects that have been put out there at the moment. I sort of look along the lines of the PC7 appeals committee was in a sense, essentially I should say, an advisory panel to the chief executive. And some of the terms of reference that committee had may be of value to looking at how we might have a advisory panel within the regulatory framework, but certainly in that PC7 appeals committee situation, it was very much the committee taking on board legal advice that's been given to them and making a summation of that information and advising the chief executive accordingly. And I see, to some degree, a similarity of process in this committee as well. So I think if there's no other information to impart, thank you, team, for your presentation today. We will have something to look at in March, and then further to council for ratification approval. So thank you all.
David.
Who's next in the chair? Vicky or Grant?
Yeah.
You two can battle out who's going to be.
Good morning, everyone. We're just having a briefing session today on Greater Christchurch Partnership's joint housing action plan process. We don't have a full house in terms of councillors, but thanks very much for the councillors that are present at the moment. And we have Jesse and Tracy, who will just introduce the paper for us. And online we have Rodney Yeoman, who's also part of the joint housing action process. And Councillor Deshae's also online. So this session is Tracy's going to give a bit of, or both of them are going to give a bit of an introduction about why this is important for us. It is a part of the spatial planning process, and also the Whakawhanaki Kaianga Committee. That was a committee involving government ministries, the Ministry of Housing and the Ministry of Transport, under the previous government. And there were some key strategic, I suppose, priorities that were set, and part of that was to do with housing. But look, I'll let you guys carry on and give us a bit of a briefing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morena councillors. Firstly, like to introduce Tracy Tierney, our Director of the Greater Christchurch Partnership. Tracy's leading this work and has been leading the spatial plan work, which you'll be familiar with. I think you've met Tracy before, just reintroduce Tracy. John Bartels, who's our strategic project lead at GCP, who's been leading this housing work, is unfortunately away sick. So he'd love to be here today, but he can't actually use his voice at the minute. So you've got Tracy and I and Rodney Yeoman online as well from Formative Limited. Rodney, on behalf of the partnership, undertook the investigation of the costs and benefits of potential options included in the joint housing action plan. So brings that level of economic expertise to the process. Just by way of background, and just to remind councillors where we've come from on this work. So the development and implementation of the Joint Housing Action Plan was committed to as part of the spatial plan for Greater Christchurch and is a work program priority for the partnership. The Housing Action Plan was endorsed by the GCP back in December 2023. All Greater Christchurch partner councils, including ourselves, adopted the Housing Action Plan back in March 2024. A working group comprising representatives from the four Greater Christchurch councils, Crown Partners, Mana Whenua and the Otatahi Community Housing Trust was established to progress the Phase 1 work of the Housing Action Plan. A workshop took place with the GCP committee back in December 2020, and briefings are now being held with each of the partner councils to present the Phase 1 findings of the work and to seek feedback to help inform development of Phase 2, which is what Tracy will walk us through in the slides. As a regional council, just in terms of our role and responsibilities, our roles really in around addressing housing affordability is very different to the three sub-regional councils in Christchurch, Selwyn and Waimakariri. We have a comparatively small role in that respect, and there are sort of fewer levers that are available to us as a regional council as well. So you'll see in the slides today, only a few of the options are directly applicable to our functions and core services, and we'll explore those a bit further. But our most direct role is really through the planning functions that we hold under the Environmental Regulation and Protection core service, and in particular the development and implementation of our RMA plans and also the regional policy statement, which you all know is now paused at the minute. And so there'll be, obviously, as we go through that process, the opportunity to further align what we're doing in the RPS to the Housing Action Plan work that we've got. I note there's also through the Canterbury Mayoral Forum a regional housing strategy that's being worked through similar to this. So we're trying to work both processes alongside each other. So we've actually got some workshops on that this afternoon as well. So that works a little bit further behind where we're at with the Greater Christchurch works. So two are informing each other. Also, just note that Plan Change 8 to the Land and Water Regional Plan will also have an effect in terms of enabling housing, particularly around stormwater discharge and those types of elements of future housing provision. So I'll now hand over to Tracy. She'll just take us quickly through the briefing material, and we're happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. It's a real pleasure to be here. Love coming out and seeing our partners and getting some korero going. And so I'm planning not to talk for too long. I'd much rather have questions. So thank you very much for your time. Just while we're here today, really important to touch back and base and make sure that where we're heading and some of the options we're looking at, really keen to explore partners' thoughts and appetite for advancing them before we spend too much time on efforts that aren't supported. So effectively, we're going through a bit of a sifting process. So I'll come back to these, but these are the questions we've taken around. So we've been going to other council briefings. You know, have we given enough information? If we're going to advance to phase 2, where's the interest? What would you support? And certainly understand and support Jessie's view in terms of the levers that Environment Canterbury has. However, there's that really key role in terms of support and advocacy at the table with implementation. So want to ensure from this governance perspective, just some initial thoughts around things that you would absolutely a red flag or things that you particularly, on behalf of the partnership, would like some energy put into. So we'll come back to those. And it gets a bit like a funnel. So obviously this is just a sounding board. We would then need to, the intention is Friday the 7th, we report back at a really high level to the committee on what we've heard and try and then get some direction about which ones should we focus our time and efforts on, with a view that we would come back with actually, this has been investigations, we now need to get on with implementing, because I'll certainly identify that a housing action plan has been on the to-do list since 2018 with one of the prior spatial plans. So it's only been since this one that we've, with the support of the committee, really put energy and resource into it. So we are very aware that we need to keep going. Just to give it a little bit of context, so, you know, everything we do is interconnected. So it's a part of the spatial plan, as Councillor Edge mentioned, but what we're truly trying to do is overlay all the key pieces that are happening in our urban environment. Because of that, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we're trying to make sure that whatever we do in housing speaks to the priority development area, speaks to mass rapid transit, looks at our environment so that we are being really cognizant of it. So that's where it sits. You may or may not remember our very passionate Lucy was here and shared this diagram about what is the problem across New Zealand and Canterbury, and what are we focusing on. And just to reiterate, I'm working really closely with the Canterbury Mayoral Forum team because there are solutions that will transcend place, and then there are some that are very focused on that urban environment. So it is part of a ecosystem. Things unfortunately aren't getting any better, and even since we first came and presented, average rents are going up. Housing affordability is certainly not decreasing. We've got an increasing number on the housing register. We belong to support the Tiwai Punamu Housing Steering Group, we were meeting at a couple of weeks ago. One of the issues they're contending with is anecdotally an increasing rise in homelessness, we think of adults on the streets, but couch surfing, no fixed abode in garages. And so they're actually doing some work to try and quantify that in our region. So unfortunately, the indicators are continuing to trend in a negative way. Great thing is, though, we can do some things about it. So just as a really high-level summary, these are the 4 things that we took away from that, from the research. And so we, as part of this investigation, we talked widely. We talked to major developers. We obviously talked to the community housing providers. We talked to funding institutions, and they were probably our 4 key takeaways. They're things that we can do, we can influence, and you have flexibility about what you do when you do it, because we're also acutely aware of the environment that everyone is functioning in from a fiscal and regulatory perspective. But there are lots of positives in there. Again, just at a very high level, grouping under each of those areas. So pro-housing, we've got a range of levers, and we're going to show you a chart shortly that talks about, of those levers, what could be most effective. But we do have those pro-housing policies. It's becoming more and more apparent with government settings that we've historically relied on planning tools to influence housing supply when housing goes. The effectiveness of those tools to get the outcomes we're looking for is getting less and less. So when we considered other tools, we really had to look outside of just the traditional planning tools. But there are still some in there that are more or less relevant to partner councils. So we've got the pro-housing policies, which have got some level of ratepayer contribution or no level of ratepayer contribution. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Leveraging partners' land. So being able to find, and we've identified as part of this, a number of more potential sites. Haven't gone through a process of identifying, so we've identified potential, haven't gone through any further at this stage to go, well, how realistic is it to provide them to housing? But providing our community housing providers and funding institutions have certainly confirmed that if councils made very long-term peppercorn leases available, that would be quite influential. Funding and finance, again, for community housing providers, the challenge they have at the moment is uncertainty. So they are looking for partners where government and central government can provide them some continuity. And we'll talk a little bit more about low or no interest loans. We looked at targeted rates and just match funding contribution on project basis. The big one at the right-hand side is really topical at the moment in terms of how do we influence significant RMA reforms. Planning is still really important, so how can we influence that, and how can we look to partner with our government and say we're putting some form of skin in the game, whether that be land, property, whatever that looks like, hopefully might encourage our government partners to partner us. And so that's the great thing about the GCP. We do have our Crown partners at the table who have been, really supportive of this, all over it, and trying to support us with this work. So inclusionary zoning, won't spend too long on this, but there's varying levels of awareness around inclusionary zoning, effectively saying that when developments are happening, there is a contribution, whether that be via land or whether that be via financial contribution, which is then made available to, and the whole policy direction about how you manage that, of course, will be a stage 2, but effectively made available for affordable housing initiatives, and importantly, they're in perpetuity. So the obvious partner in that is community housing providers. So it is a funding mechanism. We sometimes hear the term value capture, so this could be seen as a value capture tool where there is a development opportunity, that there is an uplift in that could be applied to social and affordable housing. So we can do a little bit more detail about that later if required. This is probably while it looks slightly messy, this is probably the guts of what we want to talk about today. So what we've looked at is the affordable housing outcomes, so the ones you saw on the prior slide. We felt we needed to reality check those in terms of, if we were to apply them, what housing outcomes might it have? So you'll see on the right-hand side the level of housing 25 to 34, so over a 10-year time frame that could be gathered from those actions, bearing in mind that this is just a scenario. So we've just picked certain levers. They can be completely altered and amended, and shortly I'll invite Rodney to fill in any gaps because I'm sure I've left some. But on the upward axis is the affordable housing, so the numbers. Across the bottom is easier to implement, more difficult to implement, and more dollars. So very unsurprisingly, it's the world we all live in. Very often, some of the things that are the most difficult and potentially have costs associated with them but you can see get significantly higher outcomes. And we've kind of gathered them in that basis, so the medium and medium yield. So it gives you a little bit of a reference point, understanding that actually the real potential numbers will very much get down to the levels at which these are placed. So we would need to do a bit further work on those. But I might just pause there for a moment and invite Rodney, who did this great work with us, if there's anything in particular you wanted to highlight, and then we could come back at the end for any questions for Rodney. Thanks, Rodney.
Yep. Thank you, Tracy. So you've explained the graph well there. So broadly, it shows the quantum of affordable housing that can be achieved under the different policy options that were tested. And then along the bottom axis, showing you how difficult it will be to implement them. So you've got the ones in the green, if you like, the low-hanging fruit, the ones that are relatively easy to implement. And in some cases, Christchurch City Council was already implementing some of those. And then moving towards the blue area there are some policies there that Christchurch City Council is already looking at, or maybe increasing. And then towards the red, that's obviously the more difficult, and that's around the inclusionary zoning. And at the moment, the only council in New Zealand that has inclusionary zoning is Queenstown. And in their case, up until recently, it had been voluntary, and they tried to move that through into their plan as a compulsory policy, but that was not successful in the end. But I think you'll have questions about this figure and the policies within the figure, so we can talk more about that later.
Thanks, Rodney. That's really helpful. I'm sure there'll be questions. So again, just where to from here, that's just reiterating that we're out talking to our partner member organisations. We'll do a very high-level update next week to the committee, and then take away what we think we've heard into, okay, how could we actually implement this and what would be our very clear next steps and timeframes. And with a review that we'd be coming back for an endorsement of the implementation plan, absolutely recognising that particularly the ones, along with that we'll do a timing scenario, because the ones that might have substantial cost implications or have more complex policy needs, you've got cognizant of annual plan, LTP plan, so we'll align that with the timeframes that it would take to actually make sure we're really clearly quantifying what's required. So just on discussion, just flipping back to those questions, which I'll move over. So what we've done here, and a little bit different for Environment Canada, when we've gone around and visited the councils, we've put the ones that you saw on the previous slide and put them into this chart here. The colours in the middle, what they mean is that the purple ones, or magenta, I got told there was more magenta, the purple ones are ones that really need all councils to participate in to move forward, and that's because you're not trying to displace market and you're trying to send aligned signals. The yellow ones are for ones that ideally partners would work on collectively, because they will be more effective. Should make sure I've got that around the right way. And sorry, that's the other way around. The blue ones are the ones that you work ideally on collectively. The yellows are the ones that you could work on independently. So, but obviously a number of these aren't applicable for Environment Canterbury from an implementation perspective, but obviously from a support, influencing and perspective, they certainly are. So whether we want to go through those one by one, or I think it's probably more helpful to come back to this and really open the field up for any and all questions, and we'll decide who's best placed to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. I found the other one a little bit more interesting than the previous one, but maybe take some questions related to that one and the housing affordability outcomes as well. Any, Vicky?
Yeah, so my questions actually were more around. I mean, I agree with the magenta parts, and other than perhaps the rating one, I would have thought that it would be most transparent for the districts if it's going to be a varied rate across the different districts within Greater Christchurch. I would have thought that that would then go through those districts rather than through us. And I wouldn't have thought we would have a rate separate from them and have it in split two parts, because I know that that's caused, people talk about double dipping and the like. Like, it's just clearer to people what they're paying for when it's one lump, one specific amount. So if it's across all three, through ECAN makes sense. But if it's equal, but if it's differential across those districts, then it makes more sense at the district level, in my view. And then my question's really around the affordable housing outcomes graph and relating to the figures that were given in an earlier pictorial. So that's fine. Leave it on here because I've written the numbers down. But because you've got there's an accommodation supplement, number of people. I think it was people rather than households. It might have been households actually. Looking at, let's have a look. Residents. So it is numbers of people getting accommodation supplements. So it would be interesting to know how much does that accommodation supplement account for, or what's its sum value in dollars, because that's an ongoing cost of a failing housing system that we are picking up the tab for, and it'd be much better to have that in, to enable that to be actually supporting people with positive outcomes that creates all the social benefits that secure housing provides to people and to the future generations. So I think that's where the cost benefit analysis, which I hear Rodney has been involved with, it's really important, I think, to see that cost benefit analysis and to see the figures we're talking about here. Of course, there's all those indirect monetary benefits, indirect dollar benefits through better health outcomes, avoiding judiciary system, all sorts of things that come out of that. In terms of the specific number of people on the public housing register, there's a number of 2,300, which I'm assuming that that's individuals, and that then if you look at average households and what have you, you might be looking at around about 1,200 homes specifically for that number of people. And on the basis of the graph that you've got on the screen, on the basis of the graph you've got on the screen, if you take the two collectives of easy and moderate options, that would amount to around 800 homes, I think, in 10 years. So just to address that 2,300, you might be looking at 15 odd years if you just pick off those easy ones. So I don't think you've got to apply all of the easy ones, and I don't know if some of those are mutually exclusive or if they can all be operated all in parallel. So there's a question. Assuming they can all be run in parallel, we're looking at 15 years to resolve that, and there's probably a growing problem, is what you think that's suggesting, at which point you have to look at options at the top, unless there's anything else that's been completely missed, and some, I suspect not, but if there is something else. So the question then is, in terms of Queenstown's gone some way towards that, have they started with like the lowest amount at the 1% option, which is the most monetary option, does at least get some way towards, that's like almost twice as effective as the whole collection of all of the medium and easy options. So you have to go there, have to start looking at that. Unless there's something, like I say, something else that we've got to be brave and got to look to that, and maybe start at the lowest option there and try and get that over the line and make it more normalised, that this is something that societally we have to do. So that's...
Thank you. So just lots of great comments in there, Councillor. I've also been asked that question around the accommodation benefit level of supplement in another council, so we're going to do a little bit more work on that, so we're happy to come back. And you're so right about it being essential infrastructure. So we, from a study recently done in Melbourne, they were able to quantify and go for every dollar invested in social and affordable housing, there was a $3 return. And with New Zealand, the social agency hopefully are going to be doing similar work, so we might be able to translate that to in a New Zealand scenario. So we know that this investment pays back in all of those ways. In terms of, I might get Rodney to ask just in terms of Queenstown, but just your question around, are they all mutually exclusive? No, potentially not. But it's sitting and going, well, which one, if you think about also end users and who's that's affecting, are you getting the balance right and the levels right? But that could definitely be part of phase 2 investigation. In terms of inclusionary zoning, it is used in other countries. I've certainly read where they've, like say, introduced at a low level to start getting understanding and get confidence that the money being collected is actually delivering outcomes, and then has increased over time. So, but I noticed Rodney's got his hand up, so I'll let Rodney.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, those are good points. So, yes, there are obviously easier policy options in there that could be done relatively easily, but then they don't produce as many dwellings or as many affordable houses. But in collection, if you took all those policies together, then you could be getting some substantial additional accommodation that could meet the needs of your community. Going to the point around the housing register, there will be other people who do have housing needs that aren't on the housing register as well. So that's not necessarily the complete picture of what is your needs in the district or districts. Sorry. And then finally, you were asking about Queenstown. What is their position? So their initial position that was mainly it was voluntary. So they would negotiate on a case-by-case basis with developers. And that was reflected in this policy setting here that we've tested in the medium option. So the medium option is in that pink area, the option that has been used in Queenstown. The high option is what Queenstown tried to get into place. And in that instance, they were going to levy all development in the district. The low in the table isn't a policy option that's been applied elsewhere. It was just to give you an indication of a range of potential options. And I suppose finally, moving back to one point which you were talking about the costs and benefits of the different policy options. This is an indicative assessment at this point. And a key issue with Queenstown not being able to get their policy across the line was that they didn't have sufficiently robust evidence on their policy option. So if you are to go forward with one of the inclusionary zoning policy options, then you'll need to do a fair amount of additional work beyond what has already been done to actually get across the line. But, there is obviously a large amount of housing that could be provided as a result. So it's hard, but it would be much more beneficial compared to all these other options that are available.
Thanks, Rodney.
But that's not to say you can't do these other options.
Thanks, Rodney. Councillor Robinson?
No, thanks for this. I actually haven't really looked at it in such detail before, and it's I imagine it'll be very effective once it's implemented, to some extent. I'm wondering if the repurposing of current buildings has been part of the proposal, considering they're already erected and they may be of a different use, like commercial use. But I guess the element of recycling or repurposing current buildings in the mix could be part of the solution to affordable homes, or at least they don't have to be standalone homes. They could be part of the city structure and the functionality of a future city, with lower emissions and such. I mean, there's a lot of buildings that are very close to being fit for purpose, but they're lying empty And so has that been part of the discussion?
Not specifically as part of the housing action plan, but under that overlay around the priority development areas, we've really identified as we look to develop those, we're going to have to look at work with the building owners or the landowners for exactly those opportunities, because that's a great form of intensification around those transport routes. So really good thought, and I certainly think through the priority development, but also housing, we can keep looking at that.
Thank you. I have a query on the previous slide, or just an observation really. This one here, that the items in blue there, there's a couple of mentions there in the middle. Ecam property holdings, our holdings are limited for housing opportunities, and the idea of discounted land sales, community housing trust providers, those sorts of things, that's something we haven't really looked at, but obviously that's an item there. But yeah, we would have to identify specific sites, but I think we have gone through that process and decided that probably none of our stuff, especially the central city stuff in the core, isn't suitable. I just wanted to ask the question of... Okay.
Sorry, can you just elucidate that a bit? So in terms of ECAN's land, so we've had a look at what may be available for housing development.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so we did an assessment. Tammy and my team worked with our property assets team to have a look at what land we own. Obviously, a lot of our land is for endowment purposes associated with river management, flood and river resilience. So we've only got small land holdings in the CBD, particularly next door behind us here, which may or may not be suitable, but I understand that the land behind us here behind the car park here was going through a particular process in its own right. So potential for that to actually be used for any sort of future housing opportunities would be at the discretion of the council in terms of what it wants to do with its assets. So,
and what about any land like in Christchurch that's outside of the CBD, like in Cheney's or the West?
Yeah, it depends on the land that's available and what purpose we need that land for, and whether it would actually be suitable in terms of its own. So if you're looking out further outside of the city there, whether that actually fits with where future residential development or should actually go anyway, in line with the strategic direction under the spatial plan, and the appropriate zoning that the city plan would actually allow for any residential development to occur. Yep.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, in terms of the work that that's being done on the existing land holdings of the territorial authorities, in particular Christchurch, one of the things of the Whanaka Committee was to ensure that, in terms of a priority, was looking at improving access, employment, and services to wherever housing was going to go. So it's not just plonking housing for the sake of it. It's like, if people, affordable housing, social housing, what are the needs of those people going into those houses? Just coming back to the blue line there, the partners leveraging land holdings. What, in terms of the economics, the idea of councils owning land and offering long-term peppercorn leases to people who buy and build, for example, so they're paying for the house, so there's a longer-term process of payback of the land component.
That would be held by, well, I envisaged would be held by a community housing provider in perpetuity. So it would more likely be for long-term affordable rentals. So yes, it would, and I think that would be part of what districts would want to have really clear around ownership of the land, and that it is retained for its purpose of in perpetuity.
In terms of the next slide, then the one that we're looking at, where does that component fit in the red, blue, green?
So that's in terms of the land, that hasn't been assessed other than we've got land potential. It hasn't been, because we haven't gone through that process of identifying, because we've got parcels of land that have got potential, but we'd have to go through quite an exercise of saying what level of density, what are all the impacts of that, which we're suggesting we do as a part of stage 2, because of course it's a significant amount of work, so we need to gauge level of interest first.
Right. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, Councillor Bramwell.
Just in respect to mana whenua and the possibility of papakainga and other things like that, where is I might have missed it unless it's in here, but where's that gone? Is there any, I know Tuahuriri have their Māori Reserve, etc., and they're kind of looking at that, but is there any other areas in the study at all?
So we've been really conscious and working through this project. It's also about that piece of work about finding land opportunities is also the potential to work with mana whenua and say developing papakainga in urban settings as well. And so that's a really key part of that stage 2, is to say if we've got land holdings, who do we then work with to activate that? So we talked about community housing providers, are there Māori trusts that we should be working with? So the policy direction would set guidance on how would we then best utilise and capitalise on those land opportunities to get best outcomes.
And is that component in terms of mana whenua where they are? Because I know at the last GCP meeting there was some concern that they wanted some action on that particular part of it. Is that progressing? Quite faster than what it was.
In short, we're going as fast as we can because we've got to have the licence from all our partner councils and communities and social licence to go down this path. So this is where we're at now, is the sifting, going, your communities best, you know the problem, which ones would you like to now put more time and energy into? I'm very driven, so we've picked that up and got it to this stage. I think getting an implementation plan mid-year and actually boxing on, I think everyone's super keen.
I'm glad you mentioned before that the consideration of the spatial plan and those areas identified as being for development areas, but also urban regeneration areas and the issues related to that. So another component, I suppose, in this assessment of the land component is land acquisition by partners, for example, or other people, and the process of, I suppose, for Environment Canterbury in terms of part of that coordination process. And importantly for us is this our transport plan and PT Futures, ensuring that people can go from A to B, and then wherever they're located, there's easy walking distances, those facilities are available. So that's something from our point of view that we've obviously working on that. So is that something, the regeneration part, is that primarily in the city with the PC14 and the City Council work?
It all interplays. It's a complex little network, and that diagram at the start in terms of the overlay of the priority development areas is going to become crucial. But each piece of work also has its own drivers. So, of course, the outcome of this is to get more affordable social housing. Ideally, you'd maximise that and get it around the PDA, so you're hitting multiple outcomes. But equally, if it's in whichever area it's in, it's adding to the housing, so there'll be a balancing act sitting in there. I don't know if that answers your question, but Jessie might like to add on.
Just add to that as well. I mean, it's not just limited to Christchurch City in that respect. Urban regeneration will happen in both Waimakariri and Selwyn as well. There's a lot of older housing stock in areas like, say, even Rolleston, where you have older housing stock close to the town centre, where you'll start to see changes over time, increased density, urban regeneration. Lincoln's the same. Same with Rangiora and Kaipoi. There's other parts of the greater Christchurch area townships, urban townships, that will see urban regeneration over time and have done even post-earthquake. So, yeah.
And sorry, just to add in terms of the transport aspect, it's really key, because if we're needing to look at where additional routes or MRT or state or anything like that is going, there is an opportunity to say, well, when we're developing those, is there land that then becomes surplus that could be utilised for high density housing? So that's where the multi-layered lens comes in, and transport's key.
To that as well, if you like, just in terms of our, you mentioned, Chair, the PT Futures work program. So we've obviously got a big focus on the core routes of public transport in the city, but we also have the rest of network that we need to look at over. And I know yesterday at council we had the deputation from the Aranui residents talking about the rest of the network and how it's the changes that have occurred over time in terms of public transport provision. So those are the types of things that we need to consider. In the media recently was Belfast as well. We've talked about Hawesville. There's a number of areas. Selwyn and Waimakariri also have those challenges around public transport in terms of the rest of the network, and how does that actually enable housing. In terms of affordability, that's a challenge if you haven't got access to public transport as well. So it's all part of the bigger package, is essentially what Tracy's saying, is there's multiple layers to this. So, yeah.
Yes, I think that blue diagram with all of those multiple layers, climate change, relocation of people in the future, where they go, so it's all of those sorts of things, and also natural hazard avoidance mitigation come into the play too, which provides some constraints on the housing apart from the land that's already there. Is the land suitable? What are the threats to that land and the people who could be located on it?
And the provision of infrastructure as well is a key part to that. Insurance going forward. So there's lots of different elements to it. Yeah.
Councillor Southworth?
Yeah, so outside of Environment Canterbury's role, I think, but in the bubbles, the big problem in bubbles it identifies Airbnb in particular. And so is enough being done around that? I mean, in some cities, it's become impactful enough on the local community that people are actually taking to the streets and protested about it. So, getting ahead of that, are we doing enough? And is that significant enough in terms of its impact on available housing to be?
There hasn't been, that I'm aware of, significant work done on the impact. Really interesting working with my Queenstown colleagues. And, the question they're asking themselves, is it Airbnb or is it second houses that are actually most impactful? So they're currently trying to do some thinking and put some numbers around what that actually looks like. So that will be really interesting to watch. At this stage, it's a bit of an unknown in our area.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, Queenstown is quite a specific set of circumstances. I don't think Christchurch would necessarily reflect that differential between second homes and Airbnb. So it'd be really interesting to see that done locally, specifically looking at the impact of that.
It is, just to add to that, it is something that we're considering through the regional housing strategy as well for places like Mackenzie, where you've got housing that's used for accommodation, but also a shortage of housing for workers and others as well. So there's those challenges too at a regional level in different parts of the region. So similar to Queenstown. Yep.
Just a question, not so much a question, just an observation. With the going for housing growth direction from the government, or desire for the government to increase housing, that they had suggested three things or four things. One of them was going for housing growth policy. The second was improvement to the rental market to make it easier to be a landlord and easier to be a tenant. And thirdly, build and construction changes to improve competition and lower building costs. And fourthly, better social housing to better look after those who need support. Are those factors in this new government policy, are they still in keeping with the direction that we're headed in terms of the evaluation of affordable and social housing?
I think we're all wanting the same outcomes, that's an awesome start. I think that the way that the government wants to focus its investment and financing is quite different, particularly with the Kāinga Ora review, and that's still settling. So I think these are all complementary, and the great thing is we have Crown at the table who are informing us. I think, though, one of the unfortunate side effects has been the incredible uncertainty it's created. So you'll be aware there is a lot of work that is on hold, both at Kāinga Ora and community housing sector. So we're just trying to work through that and support. So we always try and be complementary with the Crown and try and leverage. I guess the stats will start to tell over time, but at the moment they're not improving. So it's still everyone's to the helm, really, and doing everything we can.
I suppose in response to that is that the thing about the GCP partnership is that we have a spatial plan that's been agreed in conjunction with government housing and transport people. And so that direction is still there, it's still viable, and really it's how some of these issues about housing can be facilitated through developing that spatial plan and progressing with it as best we can.
I think too, you're just seeing at the moment in Christchurch and Greater Christchurch and Canterbury a big shift of people from other parts of the country migrating to Canterbury, which is a good thing for us, but it's keeping up with that rate of growth as well, and the infrastructure, the provision that's required to support that. So obviously the spatial plan was a point in time, and that will, as we grow and change over time, that'll be something that we need to consider again in a few years' time when we come back to reviewing the spatial plan at some point in time and checking where we're at with that direction as well. So, but you've seen things like even the commitments to major infrastructure projects like the roads of national significance with things like the Woodend bypass. And what does that do in terms of the potential rate of growth that we see in areas like Waimaka area as well? So with access to the city being potentially a lot easier in the future as well. So lots of things we're dependent on infrastructure investment and will impact the rate of growth as well.
Tracy, just a question: is there any before we sort of wrap up? I don't know if there's any more questions, but is there anything that you would like us to anything important that you would like to feedback from us?
Well, no, it would just be if there's any thoughts you'd like me to carry forward in terms of, are there any red flags? Are there anything that you're particularly interested in? And just overall view you'd perhaps like to express. I know it's hard given the numbers you've got here, but really willing to take on board any feedback.
Councillor Robinson?
It's just a thought that keeps coming into my mind, and it's not really talked about here, but the concept of the granny flat situation where someone may have a vast bit of land but doesn't want to subdivide necessarily, but wants to provide something as a social sort of justice situation. Is this part of the plan too, where the potential is to have community housing on private land that already has a resident living there, like it's sort of land share type thing?
Certainly the government altered a little while ago the rules around granny flats in terms of building, so not requiring consent. My understanding is, and I'm certainly not a planner, my understanding is that most of our partners are quite enabling of that happening already, because of course it adds. We don't anticipate, though, it would be significant, but it's certainly a lot easier for people to do that.
I was going to say, through the spatial plan, we had part of the future development strategy requirements is to do a housing and business capacity assessment, and when we did the spatial plan process, we had to update those assessments, and that does look at infill housing, in particular the opportunities on particular properties to be able to provide those types of housing as well. So Rodney was involved previously in that work as well. So there is that opportunity. It's having the other levers to incentivise it as well. Yeah.
Just going to say that's what I find really quite promising. It's quite a European style of housing, intensification, but without, there's more flexibility to it, but you're actually accommodating quite swiftly some of the people that need homes. So, yeah, good work anyway.
Part of that, just to add to that too, as well, we had to look at what's feasible as well. So, there's the opportunity, but is it feasible to actually do it? So, and what does that actually mean in terms of potential housing capacity for growth? So, yeah.
Just one thought to round down in the reassuring what the spatial plan found is that across the GCP area we have got plenty of capacity. So unlike other areas in the country, so the government's been focused on increasing land supply quickly. That's actually not been an issue for the partnership. We've been able to evidence that. The challenge is how do you do that affordably and deliver to market, particularly in the affordable rental and social housing space. So that's our bigger challenge.
Councillor Davies?
What's your take on the conversations around the trust doing stuff outside of Christchurch City?
So that was a key part of this work. My understanding is that they are pursuing the opportunity to go more broadly, which is an amendment to the trust deed, which is progressing. That I think has got support from councils, and certainly they're seen nationally as being quite a leader. So I think there's quite an opportunity to work with OCHT, who also do, of course, work with other smaller chips providers as well. So there's a real benefit in there if they can step outside of that Christchurch boundary.
There's a number of complications with the trust and how it's set up in terms of being able to expand its horizons beyond just Christchurch City. So that's what they're working through at the minute as well.
And I assume that the City Council have to be pretty much behind that, because I just watched a couple of their, I think it might have been a briefing where there's a little bit of pushback.
I believe they have supported it.
I'll just quickly wrap up some thoughts that I've noted down. Firstly, this the expansion, if you like, the work that you're doing outside the GCP in terms of the regional and those issues are going to be related, I suppose, to urban growth. Where does that occur? What are the services that are provided, and urban and the transportation links for anything outside the GCP? In terms of planning tools, the option in terms of influencing struck me as being on page 10. Struck me as something that, in terms of the community trust partnerships, all those sorts of things are going to be really important about how we can influence change. The other thing, inclusionary zoning, obviously that value capture stuff is really important, and a way through that and how you do that. And that kind of, the thought there was the private-public collaboration on that is a difficult space to move in and try to increase those numbers. Clearly there's issues in Queenstown, and that would probably be the same elsewhere. So the resistance is there. It was there, I think, even in the feedback of the hui mai feedback in terms of from the developers about scepticism of how that can work. The other thing is, the Papakaianga, moving forward with that, and obviously that you're liaising on that. Essential infrastructure was the other thing that you talked about that was raised. certainly those issues in terms of the spatial plan, moving on with urban regeneration planning, the development planning scenarios, and of course the MRT and the uplift along the corridors, both of the MRT in the future as well as our core routes, and the importance, given the deputation we had yesterday, on the rest of the network, because it could well be that the rest of the network is going to be of importance, because some of the land availability, whether it's land acquisition or infilling, as Councillor Robinson mentioned, the intensification of spatially just slightly outside what might be a core route now. So that will be important. The other thing was importance of social license that you talked about. But yeah, look, and then we've got those government policies as well in terms of, and immigration, of course, is rising, climate change and relocation, all those sorts of planning issues, which is what a core part of our business is. But thank you very much for the presentation, and thanks for the questions that have been asked. And I think it's good for councillors to be aware of where that project sits within the bigger picture and the bigger planning framework for the region. So thank you very much, Tracy, and thanks very much, Rodney.
Thank you.